Big Shaq was enjoying a quiet moment at McDonald's, a rare chance to blend into the crowd and escape the spotlight. Families buzzed around him, kids giggling in the play area, and the smell of fries filled the air. He was mid-bite into his burger when he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. Looking down, he saw a little boy, no older than 5, staring up at him with wide, frightened eyes. The boy leaned in close and whispered, "He has a gun." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted toward the counter, following the boy's subtle gesture. Near the front, a man stood, shifting nervously, his coat clutched tightly around him. It was a small detail, easily missed by others, but Shaq's instincts told him something wasn't right. "Stay calm," he whispered to the boy, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. His mind raced as he quickly scanned the restaurant. Families were scattered across the dining area, oblivious to the potential danger. Children laughed in the play zone, parents chatted over their meals, and employees bustled behind the counter. The man near the counter seemed to mutter to himself, his movements agitated. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hand occasionally disappearing under his coat. Shaq's years of experience in high-pressure situations kicked in. He couldn't afford to panic or draw attention. He took out his phone, pretending to check a message, but instead dialed 911. Keeping his voice low, he described the situation to the operator. "I'm at the McDonald's on Main Street," he said, his tone steady but urgent. "There's a man near the counter acting suspiciously. A kid just told me he might have a weapon. I need officers here, fast." The operator's voice was calm and professional, guiding him through the call. "Can you describe the man?" Shaq glanced back at the suspect, noting his appearance. "Tall, mid-30s, dark jacket, looks nervous. Keeps reaching under his coat." "Stay on the line," the operator instructed. "Officers are on their way. Can you keep eyes on him without drawing attention?" "Yeah," Shaq replied, his eyes never leaving the man. The boy tugged at his sleeve again. "What's going to happen?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Shaq knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "You're brave for telling me," he said softly. "I'm going to make sure everyone here is safe, okay?" The boy nodded, his small hands clutching Shaq's sleeve tightly. Shaq's mind raced with possibilities. What if the man noticed him? What if he acted before the police arrived? The thought of the families and children in the room made his stomach tighten. He couldn't let anything happen to them. As casually as he could, Shaq rose and positioned himself between the man and the play area. He wanted to be close enough to act if necessary, but not so close as to tip off the suspect. His imposing presence was an advantage, a silent message to anyone looking for trouble, not here. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Each second felt heavier than the last as Shaq kept one eye on the man and another on the entrance, waiting for the police to arrive. The suspect's behavior grew more erratic. He shifted his stance, muttered louder, and glanced around nervously. A woman at a nearby table noticed Shaq's focus and followed his gaze to the man. Her eyes widened as she picked up on the tension. Shaq subtly shook his head, signaling her to stay calm. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Though most patrons remained unaware, a faint undercurrent of unease began to ripple through the room. Shaq's phone vibrated. It was the operator again. "Officers are 2 minutes out. Stay where you are and keep the line open." The boy tugged on his sleeve one last time. "Is it going to be okay?" Shaq looked him in the eyes and smiled, radiating confidence he didn't entirely feel. "It's going to be okay. Just stay close to me." As the boy nestled against his side, Shaq braced himself. 2 minutes felt like an eternity, but he knew he had to hold his ground. Whatever happened next, he would be ready. The tension in the air was palpable as Big Shaq maintained his calm exterior, though every muscle in his body was poised to act. The man at the counter shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door as if he were expecting something, or someone. Shaq could feel the weight of the boy's trust on his shoulder, a silent reminder that he needed to stay composed. He scanned the room again, mentally mapping the positions of every patron and calculating the safest way to evacuate if necessary. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see a text from a friend asking if he was okay. He resisted the urge to reply, focusing entirely on the unfolding situation. The police were on their way, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. Every second stretched into an eternity, as he watched the man near the counter fumble with something under his coat. A faint rustle of movement caught Shaq's attention. A woman at the far end of the room stood, picking up her tray to throw away trash. Her child, a girl no older than 6, clung to her side, giggling at something on her mother's phone. The suspect's head snapped toward them, his eyes narrowing. Shaq's pulse quickened. The man's movements grew more agitated as he took a half-step forward, his hand disappearing fully under his jacket. Shaq knew he couldn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, placing himself firmly in the suspect's line of sight. His towering presence was undeniable, and for a moment, the man froze, his eyes meeting Shaq's. Shaq didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. He simply held the man's gaze with an intensity that conveyed both strength and control. The silent challenge hung in the air. If you try anything, I'll stop you. The man hesitated, his hand hovering beneath his coat. Shaq could feel the tension rippling through the room now, even among those who hadn't fully grasped what was happening. A few patrons glanced nervously between Shaq and the suspect, sensing the unspoken standoff. The woman with the child quickly sat back down, her instincts telling her something wasn't right. Shaq's phone buzzed again, and this time, he subtly checked it. A text from the 911 dispatcher read, "Officers outside. Awaiting confirmation." Relief washed over him, but he knew the situation was far from over. He had to find a way to alert the police without escalating the man's behavior. He moved slowly toward the counter, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The suspect's eyes flickered with uncertainty as Shaq approached. Standing a few feet away, Shaq pretended to examine the menu board, his phone still in his hand. He tilted the screen just enough for the employees behind the counter to see the message. "Danger! Man with weapon! Police outside!" The cashier's eyes widened briefly before she quickly masked her reaction. Shaq gave her a small nod, silently urging her to stay calm. She subtly glanced toward the kitchen and whispered something to her coworkers, who began moving toward the back exit. The man noticed the movement and shifted uneasily again, his hand twitching under his coat. Shaq decided to break the silence. His deep voice cut through the air like a knife, calm yet commanding. "You good, bro?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. The question was simple, non-confrontational, but it carried weight. The man froze, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. His hand trembled beneath his jacket. Shaq took another step closer, his size and presence radiating an unshakable authority. "It's all good, man. Just relax," Shaq said, his tone measured and even. The man's eyes darted around the room, his panic evident now. It was as if Shaq's words had cracked through the fragile shell of his resolve. The suspect took a shaky breath, his hand slipping out from under his jacket to reveal nothing. Just an empty, trembling hand. Shaq didn't let his guard down. "That's it," he said, his voice steady. "Take it easy." He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him now, the weight of their collective fear and hope pressing down. Outside, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as the police arrived. The man flinched at the sound, his body tense and on the verge of bolting. Shaq took another step forward, blocking the man's path to the door. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice softer now but no less firm. "It's not worth it." The man's face crumpled, a mix of fear, anger, and desperation flashing across his features. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, but then his shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him as he raised his hands in surrender. The front doors burst open, and officers flooded the restaurant, weapons drawn. Shaq stepped back, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. The police moved in quickly, securing the man and escorting him outside. As the tension in the room broke, a collective sigh of relief swept through the patrons. Shaq turned back to the boy, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. "You did good, little man," Shaq said, crouching down to his level. "You were brave, and you helped keep everyone safe." The boy nodded, his small chest puffing out with pride. As the officers led the suspect away, one of them approached Shaq. "You handled that like a pro," the officer said. Shaq shrugged, his usual humility shining through. "Just did what I had to do." The restaurant buzzed with whispered conversations as people tried to process what had just happened. Shaq glanced around, his eyes landing on the boy once more. He gave the kid a thumbs up before quietly slipping out the door, blending back into the world as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The air outside was crisp as Big Shaq stepped into the parking lot, but the weight of the recent events lingered heavily on his shoulders. A crowd had started to form near the police vehicles, drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion. Whispers filled the air as people speculated about what had happened inside. Shaq kept his head low, his towering frame impossible to miss but his demeanor humble, as always. He wasn't looking for attention, he simply wanted to ensure everyone was safe. One of the officers approached him, a young woman with a firm but respectful tone. "Sir, we'd like to get a statement from you," she said, her notebook already in hand. Shaq nodded, his voice calm as he recounted the events. He detailed the boy's whisper, the suspect's suspicious behavior, and his attempts to de-escalate the situation without causing panic. The officer listened intently, scribbling notes, but occasionally looking up, her expression a mix of admiration and gratitude. "You handled that incredibly well," she said when he finished. "Most people wouldn't have kept their cool like you did." Shaq gave a modest shrug. "Just did what I could. The real hero's the kid who spoke up." The officer glanced over at the boy, who was now sitting in the back of his mother's car, wrapped in a blanket. His mother was speaking with another officer, her face pale but composed. The sight stirred something in Shaq, an understanding of how close they had all come to a potential tragedy. As the officers continued their investigation, Shaq found himself approached by a middle-aged man who introduced himself as the restaurant manager. "I just want to say thank you," the manager began, his voice trembling slightly. "What you did in there, you might have saved lives. I don't even know how to repay you." Shaq waved it off. "No need, bro. Just glad everyone's okay." But the manager insisted, his gratitude spilling over. "You don't understand. My daughter was in there too. She was in the back helping out. If something had happened..." His voice broke, and he cleared his throat, trying to compose himself. "Thank you?" The words hit Shaq harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being seen as a hero, not in this way. His public persona was larger than life, but moments like this grounded him, reminding him of the impact one person's actions could have. He reached out and patted the manager on the shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "We all just gotta look out for each other, man." As the commotion began to die down, Shaq spotted the boy and his mother walking toward him. The mother's eyes were red, but her expression was one of fierce determination. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice wavering. "My son told me everything. If you hadn't been there, I don't even want to think about it." Shaq crouched down to the boy's level, his massive frame making the child look even smaller. "What's your name, little man?" he asked. "Liam," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Liam, you're the real MVP today. You were brave, and you did the right thing. Don't ever forget that." Shaq held out his fist, and Liam hesitated for a moment before bumping it with his own. A small smile crept onto the boy's face, and for the first time that evening, he seemed to relax. The mother clasped her hands together, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "You're an incredible role model," she said. "Thank you for being there." Shaq nodded, his humility shining through. "It's all about being in the right place at the right time." As they walked away, Shaq leaned against a nearby lamppost, taking a moment to breathe. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving him feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. He thought about the man who had been taken into custody, wondering what had driven him to such desperation. There was no justification for what he'd almost done, but Shaq couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. Life had a way of breaking people, he thought. Some fought through it, while others succumbed to the weight. He hoped the man would find a way to change, to turn his life around before it was too late. The officer who had taken his statement returned, handing him a card. "If you need anything or remember anything else, give us a call," she said. "And again, thank you. What you did was incredible." Shaq pocketed the card and gave her a nod. "Appreciate it. Y'all take care." As he walked back to his car, the crowd parted to let him through, murmurs of admiration following in his wake. He didn't acknowledge them, not out of arrogance but because he didn't see himself as the hero they did. To him, it was simple: you step up when you're needed. Sliding into the driver's seat, Shaq took one last look at the scene behind him. The flashing lights, the crowd, the officers wrapping up their work, it all felt surreal. He started the engine, the familiar hum grounding him in the moment. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his mind drifted to Liam. He hoped the boy would carry the lesson of courage with him, using it to navigate whatever challenges life threw his way. In a world full of chaos, moments of bravery like Liam's were what made the difference. Driving into the night, Shaq felt a sense of quiet resolve. The world was unpredictable, filled with both darkness and light. But as long as people like Liam existed, and as long as he could do his part, there was hope. And sometimes, hope was all anyone needed. The following morning, Shaq sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. The weight of the previous day's events lingered in his mind, even as the sunlight streamed through the windows, bringing with it the promise of a new day. The air in the room felt calm, yet Shaq couldn't shake the image of the boy's eyes, wide with fear, but unyielding in his resolve to speak up. Liam's words had reverberated through Shaq's mind all night, and it left him wondering about the thin line between a normal day and disaster. Shaq leaned back in his chair, letting the silence of his home settle around him. As much as he tried to block out the noise of the world, he knew the truth: society was fraught with tension, violence, and uncertainty. People were just one decision away from tragedy, and in that moment at McDonald's, the difference had been made by a 5-year-old child. The weight of responsibility that came with that realization was heavier than any trophy or accolade he'd ever received. The knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he rose to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was the restaurant manager from the night before, a man whose demeanor had shifted from anxiety to relief. His face was slightly flushed, and he held out a small box wrapped in simple brown paper. I wanted to give you this," he said, almost apologetically. Shaq took the box and raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" The manager shifted uneasily. "It's just a small token of appreciation, something for you to know how much your actions meant to us." Shaq opened the box to reveal a small framed photograph. It was a picture of the restaurant, a candid shot of patrons sitting and eating, their faces relaxed and at ease. At the center of it all was a smiling Liam, holding a toy in one hand and flashing a bright, carefree grin. Shaq's eyes softened as he looked at the boy's face, a symbol of innocence and hope. "It's beautiful," Shaq said, his voice low. "I didn't expect this." The manager hesitated before speaking again. "You saved lives, man. That's more than just heroism. You prevented a nightmare. You helped us avoid something we don't ever want to see again." Shaq nodded slowly. "I just did what needed to be done." The manager's face tightened, as though he were holding back emotions that had only just begun to surface. "We're trying to raise Liam right," he said quietly. "The way he stepped up, it wasn't just luck. He's learning from people like you. People who know what it means to make a difference." Shaq glanced back at the photo, feeling the weight of the manager's words. He didn't consider himself a mentor, certainly not in the traditional sense, but the thought of being someone's role model, especially a child's, was both humbling and intimidating. "I hope he continues to be that brave," Shaq said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "That's what the world needs more of, people who aren't afraid to act when it counts." The manager smiled and nodded. "Thank you again. For everything." As he closed the door and returned to his seat, Shaq found himself reflecting on the broader implications of yesterday's events. It wasn't just about stopping one potentially dangerous individual. It was about creating a culture where people, especially children, felt empowered to speak up and act. He thought about Liam's courage, and how, in his small, unassuming way, the boy had catalyzed an important change. Shaq's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. He checked the screen and saw a message from a close friend, *. The news picked up on the McDonald's story. You're trending. Just thought you should know. Shaq sighed, knowing that with the rise in public attention came a certain amount of scrutiny. It wasn't the first time he had been thrust into the spotlight, but it always made him uncomfortable. The public's fascination with him as a larger-than-life figure was something he could never fully understand. But this situation felt different. It wasn't about the fame. It was about the principle, the lessons people could take from the story. The bravery of a child, the heroism of an ordinary man, and the quiet way in which courage could save lives. The next few days saw more news stories and interviews about the McDonald's incident. Shaq found himself at the center of a media storm, with people praising his calm under pressure and his quick thinking. They even called him a real-life hero. It felt surreal, almost as though the event had taken place in another lifetime. But as much as the spotlight shone on him, Shaq remained focused on the bigger picture. The real story, he knew, was not about his actions but the ripple effect they had caused. One of the reporters reached out to him for a sit-down interview. Shaq, you've been hailed as a hero after your actions at McDonald's. How does it feel to be recognized for something so extraordinary? Shaq paused, the weight of the question pulling him into deeper thought. It feels humbling, he said, his voice measured. But the real hero isn't me. It's Liam. It's everyone who chooses to stand up, no matter the cost. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that each person has the power to make a difference. You just have to be willing to act. The reporter nodded, sensing the depth of Shaq's response. So, you're saying that heroism is in all of us? Shaq leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Absolutely. We all have the ability to change the course of someone's life. The question is whether we're willing to take that step when the moment arrives. Shaq's words echoed in his mind long after the interview ended. Heroism, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures or accolades. It was about recognizing the moment when action was required, stepping up, and doing what was right. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. There was a larger conversation at play, a conversation about resilience, about the courage to confront fear, and about how society could evolve to embrace those qualities. For Shaq, the story had never been about him. It had always been about the power of one person to make a difference, no matter how small the action seemed. The days passed, and the news cycle eventually moved on, but Shaq didn't forget the lesson Liam had taught him. The world needed more people like that boy, more people who weren't afraid to speak up when it mattered. And perhaps, just perhaps, if enough of them stood together, the world could start shifting towards something better. Something more inclusive, more just, and ultimately, more compassionate. As Shaq stepped out onto his front porch that evening, he took a deep breath, staring at the horizon. It was a new day, another opportunity to lead, to teach, and to inspire. And as long as he was able, that's exactly what he intended to do. Shaq woke up the next morning to a flood of messages and notifications. As expected, his phone was buzzing nonstop with media requests, public reactions, and even personal messages from friends and family. The recognition felt overwhelming, but he knew this was part of the process. The media love a good story, especially one with a heroic twist. However, the more he reflected on the events of the previous day, the less he felt like a hero. To him, he was just a man doing what needed to be done. It was Liam, the child, who had been the catalyst for everything that followed. As the day wore on, Shaq found himself unable to shake the feeling of discomfort that came with being placed on a pedestal. The idea of being celebrated for something he didn't fully see as extraordinary made him uneasy. Yes, he'd acted swiftly, but so had many others in similar situations. The difference, he thought, lay in the choice to do something, in the moment when Liam had whispered his warning. That was the key, a split-second decision to speak up, to act, to risk everything for the sake of others. While the media continued to cover the McDonald's story, Shaq received an unexpected message from a woman he'd never met. Her name was Ava, and she had seen the interview he'd given the day before. She wanted to meet with him. Her message was simple yet intriguing. I believe you don't see it yet, but what happened was a turning point for more than just the people at that McDonald's. I'd like to explain. Intrigued but cautious, Shaq agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe later in the afternoon. He wasn't sure what to expect, but her words struck a chord. There was something about her message that suggested a deeper meaning, one that went beyond the usual media circus that followed acts of heroism. When they met, Ava wasted no time. What you did was more than just saving lives, she said. You became part of something bigger, a symbol of accountability, a shift in how we view crisis and heroism in this society. People need leaders like you, not because of what you did in the moment, but because of what you represent. Shaq frowned. I don't see myself as a leader, though. I just did what needed to be done. Ava leaned in, her eyes serious. That's the problem. You don't realize the impact of your actions. That boy, Liam, spoke up because you made him feel safe. You gave him the courage to do the right thing. And in doing so, you sparked a ripple effect that extends far beyond that moment. Shaq paused, letting her words sink in. He had thought about his own actions, but he hadn't considered the broader implications. He had been focused on the immediate crisis, not the larger message it sent about accountability, about standing up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. You're talking about a cultural shift, Shaq said, his voice quieter now. A shift in how we respond to danger, how we react when things aren't right. But that's not on me. I'm just a guy in the right place at the right time. Ava shook her head. That's where you're wrong. Your actions might have been immediate, but they created space for others to follow. It's about leadership, even if you don't think of it that way. The world needs people who are willing to make tough choices, to set examples of courage and empathy. The conversation lingered with Shaq long after he left the cafe. What Ava had said made sense, but it also made him uncomfortable. He had never sought to be a figurehead or a role model, but now, the weight of that responsibility felt undeniable. The truth was, there was no going back. He had stepped into a role that he hadn't asked for, but that he now had to embrace. That evening, Shaq reflected on everything that had transpired, the media coverage, the public's admiration, and the quiet way that Liam had sparked something in him. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the idea that a single action could shift the course of a situation, could inspire others to step up and make the right choice in a crisis. He thought of Liam again, how the child's courage had mirrored his own, how their paths had crossed at exactly the right moment. The next day, Shaq decided to take a more active role in this newfound responsibility. He reached out to the McDonald's franchise where the incident had occurred, offering to speak with the staff and local community about the lessons they could take away from that day. It wasn't about being celebrated. It was about passing on what he had learned. The first session he held was small, just a few employees gathered in the back room of the restaurant. He shared his perspective on the incident, emphasizing that it wasn't about heroism. It was about stepping up when it mattered, no matter how difficult or risky. He talked about the importance of accountability, how every person in the room had the potential to act when faced with a similar situation, and how empathy for others could often be the difference between life and death. Shaq didn't sugarcoat anything. He acknowledged the fear, the chaos, and the uncertainty that people felt in moments of crisis. But he also emphasized the power of resilience, of standing tall in the face of adversity. He encouraged everyone to remember that the choices they made could have a lasting impact on those around them. As the session ended, one of the employees, a young woman named Maria, came up to Shaq. I never thought about it that way, she admitted. I've always been the type to freeze up in stressful situations, but what you said makes me think I could be better at responding. Shaq smiled, a sense of satisfaction warming him. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present, being willing to do something when others might hesitate. Every little action counts. Over the next few weeks, Shaq continued to engage with the community. He spoke at local schools, at public events, and even participated in conversations about crisis management and leadership. His message was clear: leadership wasn't about power or status. It was about being a person others could look to when things went wrong. It was about empathy, accountability, and the courage to do what was right, no matter how tough it seemed. Through these interactions, Shaq saw firsthand the change that was happening. People began to speak out more, to advocate for others, and to show up when it mattered. The ripple effect he had started was gaining momentum, and he realized that this wasn't just about him, or the boy at McDonald's. It was about creating a shift in the way society thought about heroism, about how every person had the capacity to make a difference. Shaq's journey wasn't just about being a hero in the eyes of the public. It was about understanding that every action, no matter how small, had the power to create a legacy. Through his own growth and transformation, he was helping others see that heroism wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about taking action when it counted the most. And in that, he found the true meaning of leadership. Shaq stood before a crowd of young people in a local community center. His speech was prepared, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. There were dozens of eyes on him, not just looking for inspiration, but for answers. It felt different than being at McDonald's, when it was just a matter of reacting in the moment. This time, he wasn't just a bystander to history. He was actively shaping it, or at least he hoped he was. "Thank you for being here today," Shaq began, his voice steady but laced with a seriousness that he hadn't expected. "I want to talk to you all about the power of choice, the power of action, and the responsibility we all carry in moments of crisis. I didn't wake up one day thinking I'd be standing here. I was just a guy, a father, a brother, a friend. But when I was faced with a situation that required quick thinking, I didn't hesitate. I knew I had to act. Not because I'm special, but because in moments of danger, you don't always have the luxury of waiting for someone else to do something." He paused, his gaze scanning the room, meeting the eyes of each person there. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. This was no longer about a single event, it was about something far deeper. Shaq continued, but his tone was softer, almost reflective. "There was a child in that McDonald's who saw something wrong. A child who had the courage to speak up. Liam wasn't just talking about a potential threat. He was talking about what he knew was right. His voice broke through the noise, and because of that, lives were saved. But let me tell you something, what Liam did wasn't extraordinary. What he did was simple. He acted." Shaq took a breath, allowing his words to hang in the air for a moment. He didn't want to speak about heroism. That word, he had learned, carried too much weight. "I didn't do anything special. What I did was make sure people had a safe space to act. It was Liam who made the choice to speak up, and it was me who gave him the room to do so." He could see the crowd was leaning in now, listening, absorbing. The truth was, Shaq wasn't speaking to them as a hero. He was speaking as someone who understood that real leadership wasn't about being the loudest or the most visible. Leadership was about quiet strength, about knowing when to step up and when to step back. You might not always be the one to step into the spotlight. You might never face a situation like mine, but every day, you make choices. You choose to speak up or stay silent, to step forward or hold back. Those choices matter. As Shaq spoke, he began to feel something shift within himself. It wasn't about public recognition anymore. It wasn't about being the person everyone looked to when things went wrong. It was about the idea that anyone could make a difference, no matter how small the act seemed. It wasn't about fame, it was about fostering an environment where people felt empowered to act when the world needed it most. "I didn't do this for the applause," Shaq continued. "But if you want to know the truth, if you really want to know the real reason I'm standing here today, it's because I want you all to understand that heroism is a choice. Leadership is a choice. And it's a choice you make every single day. You don't need a uniform or a title. You need the courage to do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. He could feel the weight of their gazes, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident. His message wasn't about the event itself. It was about empowering others to take ownership of their actions. He could see it in their eyes. Some of them were starting to understand. The fear they once had about not measuring up to the so-called heroes was beginning to melt away. They weren't less than, they were part of the same movement. Think about it, Shaq went on. You're at school, or work, or with your family, and you notice something wrong. You see a classmate being bullied, or a co-worker being mistreated, or a neighbor who needs help. Will you speak up? Will you act, even when it's uncomfortable? Even when there's risk involved? That's where true leadership starts, when you make a choice, not for yourself, but for the people around you. The room was silent now, and Shaq let the words sit with everyone, letting the message sink in. He could see the shift happening, even in the smallest ways. People were beginning to question their own behaviors, their own reactions. Would they act, or would they wait for someone else? Shaq smiled softly to himself. In the weeks following the McDonald's incident, he had felt uncertain about his role in the world. He didn't want to be seen as a hero, didn't want people looking to him as the example of what it meant to be courageous. But as he stood there, in that room full of young people, he understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't about the single act of saving lives. It wasn't about being thrust into the spotlight for a moment of bravery. It was about how that moment could be used to ignite something bigger, a movement, a cultural shift, where people didn't just act because they were asked to, but because they understood the importance of standing up for what's right. It was about shifting from a place of fear and hesitation to a place of courage and action. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Shaq said, his voice steady now. I'm not asking you to never feel afraid. What I'm asking is that you make the choice when it matters. That's how we change things. That's how we make the world a better place, not by waiting for the right moment, but by choosing to make a difference whenever we can. As the speech ended, Shaq could see that the people in the room were different. He had sparked something within them, an understanding that leadership wasn't about titles, or even recognition. It was about action. It was about choice. It was about the willingness to stand up, no matter how difficult it might seem. Shaq left the community center that day feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The recognition from the media no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like an opportunity, a chance to continue the message he had started. People weren't looking for a hero, they were looking for a reminder that they had the power to act when it mattered. And that was a message worth sharing. Shaq arrived at the police station, his mind still processing everything that had happened. He wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation ahead, but he knew it was important. The officers who had responded to the call had shown up just in time, preventing a tragedy. But Shaq's role wasn't just about calling 911. It was about understanding the bigger picture, the societal issues that led to those tense moments at McDonald's. He had seen how quickly things could escalate, how fear could cloud judgment, and how easy it was to get lost in the chaos. Sitting across from Detective Harris, a veteran officer, Shaq felt the weight of his words even before they were spoken. Harris was known for his no-nonsense attitude, but there was a sense of respect in his eyes. Shaq hadn't realized how important this moment would be, how it would affect the broader conversation about accountability, race, and the need for change. So, Shaq, Harris began, leaning forward, his hands resting on the table. We've been talking about your actions that day, and I have to say, you did what a lot of people wouldn't have done. You kept your cool, you made the right call, and you acted fast. But we need to talk about what came before that. What you saw in that restaurant, that suspicion, how did you know something wasn't right? Shaq leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he remembered the moment. It wasn't just about the whisper from the boy or the tension in the air. It was about how he had read the situation. How he knew, even without all the facts, that something dangerous could unfold. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, a gut instinct that told him to pay attention. It was the little things, Shaq said slowly, choosing his words carefully. It wasn't just the guy's behavior, the way he was standing at the counter. It was how people were reacting to him. You could see the unease in their faces. And then I heard Liam, the kid, whispering to me. He said the words, "He has a gun." And that's when I knew I had to act. But it wasn't just about responding in the moment. It was about understanding what could happen if I didn't. Harris nodded, taking notes, his eyes never leaving Shaq. You're saying it was more than just a hunch. You were looking at the bigger picture, the risk, the potential for escalation. Shaq nodded. Exactly. I knew I had to do something to keep people calm, to keep them safe. But I also knew that by doing so, I might prevent something far worse from happening. It wasn't just about saving lives in that moment. It was about taking responsibility for what could have been. Harris sat back, processing what Shaq had said. You're talking about accountability. About being prepared to make the right choice, even when no one's looking. Shaq looked at Harris, his eyes steady. That's what it's about. We live in a world where people are afraid to step up, afraid of the consequences. But if we don't take responsibility for what's happening around us, who will? It's easy to be passive, to wait for someone else to fix things. But real change comes from taking ownership of the moment, from being accountable for the actions that could save lives. The detective's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. I think you're right. We've seen too many incidents where people freeze, where they hesitate to intervene. It's the fear of doing the wrong thing, of being judged for stepping in. But your quick thinking, your decision to call 911 and keep people calm, it made all the difference. Shaq nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He had acted, not out of a desire to be a hero, but out of a sense of responsibility to those around him. He had seen firsthand how quickly a situation could spiral, how fear could drive people to make irrational decisions. But it was in those moments of uncertainty that true leadership emerged, not from grand gestures or loud declarations, but from quiet, decisive action. And that's where we are as a society. Shaq continued, his voice steady. We've got to start looking out for one another. We've got to start taking ownership of our actions, even when it's uncomfortable. We can't wait for someone else to fix it. We've got to be the ones to make the change. Harris nodded, his expression serious. I think this conversation is part of that change, Shaq. We need more people to understand that stepping up isn't about being a hero, it's about being human. It's about understanding that we all have a role to play in keeping our communities safe. And I think you've shown people that. Shaq felt a surge of gratitude. This conversation wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had witnessed the event and those who would hear the story in the future. The message was clear. Heroism wasn't reserved for a select few. It was a choice anyone could make. And in making that choice, they could change the course of a situation. I just hope people understand that it's not about me, Shaq said, his voice humble. It's about what we can do together. It's about how we can be better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. We all have a responsibility to act, to do something when the moment calls for it. The detective sat quietly for a moment, then leaned forward, his tone almost reverent. You've made a difference, Shaq. Not just in that restaurant, but in the way people think about responsibility, leadership, and the role they can play in their communities. I think you've set a new standard for what it means to step up. And that's something we all need to take to heart. Shaq looked down at his hands, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The story of what had happened at McDonald's wasn't just a single moment, it was part of a much larger narrative, one that touched on everything from community values to individual accountability. And it was that story, he realized, that he wanted to continue telling. As he stood up to leave, Shaq felt a renewed sense of purpose. The lessons he had learned in those tense moments were far from over. They were just beginning. And now, it was up to him, and others like him, to carry that message forward, to advocate for a world where people were empowered to act, to speak up, and to lead with integrity. His journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the weeks passed, Shaq's actions at McDonald's continued to ripple through the community. What had begun as a tense and unpredictable moment now became a catalyst for deeper conversations about safety, responsibility, and the collective role in creating positive change. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting not just the harrowing events but the calm leadership displayed by Shaq in the midst of fear. Interviews flooded in, but Shaq was careful in how he approached each one. His goal was clear: to emphasize that the real heroes were not just the ones who stepped in, but also those who remained committed to creating lasting change. He soon found himself participating in discussions about public safety and community leadership. He was invited to panels, speaking to audiences about the need for collective action, accountability, and proactive intervention in the face of danger. For Shaq, it wasn't about the accolades or the recognition, it was about sharing the lesson he had learned firsthand, that heroism wasn't a singular act, but a series of decisions made in the face of adversity. One afternoon, Shaq sat down with an old friend, Marcus, who had been following his journey closely. Marcus had known Shaq long before the McDonald's incident, back when Shaq was just starting out in his career. They'd spent countless hours together, talking about everything from the struggles of growing up in a tough neighborhood to the pressures of maintaining a public image. But today's conversation was different. It wasn't about the past, it was about the future, and the responsibility they both felt to make a difference. "You've changed, man," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been watching you, and I can tell this whole thing has hit you hard. I mean, you've always been about doing the right thing, but now, what you're doing, it's like you've leveled up." Shaq smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "It's not about leveling up, Marcus. It's about realizing that everything we do, every decision we make, has a ripple effect. That day at McDonald's I acted because I knew I had to. But that moment, that one instance, can teach us all something about how we respond to crisis. We have the power to choose, to act, to lead, to make a difference." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You've always been a natural leader, but I guess I never realized how much of that comes from understanding what's at stake. How much of that comes from the way you see the world now, not just as it is, but as it could be." Shaq looked out the window, deep in thought. "It's not just about one moment, one crisis. It's about the big picture. The way people live their lives, the way they react to fear, it's all connected. And if we're ever going to change things, we've got to start by changing the way we think about ourselves, about our communities. We've got to be willing to step up, even when it's hard." The conversation drifted into other topics: Shaq's plans for the future, the ongoing work he was doing with local advocacy groups, and his involvement with youth programs aimed at teaching responsibility, leadership, and accountability. But beneath the surface, it was clear that Shaq had undergone a transformation. He wasn't just using his platform to share his story, he was using it to inspire others to take responsibility for their own actions, to be leaders in their own right, and to foster a sense of unity in their communities. Later that week, Shaq found himself speaking at a local high school. The students, many of whom had heard about the McDonald's incident, listened intently as Shaq spoke about what it meant to be a leader in the face of fear. He shared the lessons he had learned, emphasizing that heroism wasn't about grand gestures. It was about making the right choices, even in the smallest of moments. As he spoke, he noticed the impact his words were having on the students. They weren't just listening, they were thinking, reflecting, and asking questions. One student, a young woman named Tasha, raised her hand. "Mr. Shaq, what do you do when you don't feel like you have the power to make a difference? What if you're just one person, and you don't know what to do?" Shaq smiled, recognizing the vulnerability in her voice. "Tasha, that's the thing. You don't have to be anyone special to make a difference. You don't have to wait for permission or for someone else to step in. You have the power to act right now. It starts with small decisions, decisions that seem insignificant at the time but build up over time. You choose to be kind, to stand up for others, to speak out against injustice. And when you make those choices consistently, they become part of who you are. That's leadership." The room was silent for a moment, as the weight of Shaq's words settled in. It was clear that the students were starting to understand, starting to see how they could make a difference, even in their own lives. And that, Shaq realized, was the true power of his experience. It wasn't about the accolades or recognition, It was about showing others that they had the ability to change the world around them, one small act of courage at a time. As Shaq left the school that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people he had inspired, all the lives he had touched. The ripple effect of his actions was continuing to grow, and the message was spreading. Accountability, responsibility, and leadership were the foundations of a better future. The story of the McDonald's incident had become more than just a moment in time. It had become a movement, one that was shaping the way people thought about themselves and their communities. Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Detective Harris. "Keep going, Shaq. You're changing things." Shaq smiled, feeling the weight of those words. He had stepped up in a moment of crisis, but now, with each new conversation, each new person he inspired, he was continuing to lead. The work was far from over, but he was committed to seeing it through. Because, in the end, it wasn't just about responding to a crisis. It was about creating a world where crises didn't need to happen in the first place. And that was a world worth fighting for.